Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The Spark of Change. Aaliyah Johnson strode confidently through the bustling airport terminal, her tailored navy pantsuit a testament to her polished professionalism. Each step she took reverberated with purpose. The rhythmic click of her heels punctuated the controlled chaos of travelers rushing to their gates. Aaliyah was no stranger to airports or first-class accommodations. She'd earned her way there through grit and determination, carving a path as one of the most formidable civil rights attorneys in the country. Her hands clutched a leather laptop bag filled with case files, evidence, and legal briefs. The upcoming week held a monumental trial, a multi-million-dollar discrimination lawsuit that could set a precedent for countless others. But for now, the plane was her haven, a rare respite in a life dominated by courtrooms, late nights, and the unyielding fight for justice. As she approached the boarding gate, a familiar sense of pride bubbled within her. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who offered a polite smile and directed her to the jet bridge. Stepping onto the aircraft, Aaliyah was greeted by the calming scent of leather seats and the soft glow of ambient lighting. She moved gracefully toward her first-class seat, 2A, a window spot that promised a view of the world below. Aaliyah placed her bag under the seat in front of her and sat down. She leaned back into the plush leather, feeling the weight of the world momentarily lift. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled through her calendar. Meetings, court dates, strategy sessions, her week was a labyrinth of responsibilities. Yet, amidst it all, she cherished this fleeting moment of stillness. As the other passengers trickled in, Aaliyah closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her into a light meditation. She thought about the case she was working on, a single mother fired unjustly for standing up to workplace discrimination. It was a story that echoed her own mother's struggles years ago, fueling Aaliyah's relentless drive to fight for the underdog. But her peace was abruptly interrupted. "Ma'am," a sharp voice pierced through her thoughts. Aaliyah opened her eyes to find a flight attendant standing in the aisle beside her. The woman, in her mid-40s, had perfectly styled blonde hair and a uniform that screamed meticulousness. Her lips were pressed into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes?" Aaliyah replied, her tone polite but firm. "May I see your ticket, please?" the attendant asked, her voice laced with an edge of suspicion. Aaliyah's brows furrowed slightly. "Of course," she said, reaching into her blazer pocket. She handed over the ticket, watching as the flight attendant scanned it, her eyes narrowing in disbelief. "This seat is reserved for first-class passengers," the attendant said, her tone sharper now. Aaliyah tilted her head, maintaining her composure. "I am a first-class passenger," she said calmly. "Is there an issue?" The attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking over Aaliyah's outfit, her bag, and, Aaliyah could sense it, the color of her skin. "I'll need to verify this," she said curtly, before walking away with the ticket. The exchange hadn't gone unnoticed. A few passengers in first class exchanged awkward glances, whispering among themselves. Aaliyah remained seated, her spine straight, her gaze steady. Years of facing subtle and overt discrimination had taught her to choose her battles wisely. But this was different. The flight attendant returned moments later, still holding the ticket. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm going to have to ask you to move to the main cabin." Aaliyah blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" "This seat was booked in error," the attendant continued, her voice rising slightly. "We need it for another passenger." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "I paid for this seat." "There's no error." "Ma'am, I don't want to cause a scene," the attendant said, lowering her voice but keeping her tone firm. Aaliyah glanced around. Every pair of eyes in first class was now on her. The tension was palpable, and she could feel the weight of their gazes. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, and a few had expressions that betrayed quiet support. "I'm not moving," Aaliyah said firmly, her voice steady. "I purchased this seat, and I have every right to remain here." The attendant opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a commotion erupted in the aisle behind them. A young child had spilled a drink, and a flustered parent was trying to clean it up while apologizing profusely. The attendant shot Aaliyah a tight-lipped glare before walking off to address the situation. Aaliyah exhaled, her hands gripping the armrests. She could feel her heart pounding, but she refused to let it show. Years of courtroom battles had taught her the art of maintaining poise under pressure. Still, the incident left a sour taste in her mouth. As the minutes ticked by, the flight attendant didn't return, but Aaliyah could feel the tension lingering in the air. She straightened her shoulders and turned her gaze toward the window, determined not to let the incident rattle her. She had work to do, and she wouldn't allow this moment of prejudice to derail her focus. But as she stared out at the runway, a quiet determination settled over her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Aaliyah Johnson wasn't just a passenger on this flight, she was a fighter, and she had a way of turning moments of injustice into catalysts for change. Little did she know, the next 7 minutes would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone on that plane. The plane began to fill with the murmurs of passengers settling into their seats, the crinkling of newspapers, and the hum of overhead bins being closed. Aaliyah tried to focus on her breathing, forcing herself to remain calm. Yet, the subtle glances and whispered conversations around her only served to remind her of the incident moments ago. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered bias, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But the brazenness of the flight attendant's actions still stung. A younger couple across the aisle exchanged uneasy looks. The man leaned toward his partner, whispering something that made her purse her lips and shake her head. Another man, older and wearing a suit, seemed engrossed in his tablet but occasionally flicked his eyes toward Aaliyah. She could feel the weight of their observations as if they were silently taking notes on her every move. Then, just as she thought the situation might dissolve into an uncomfortable memory, the flight attendant returned. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man wearing a navy blazer and a name tag identifying him as the flight supervisor. His expression was unreadable, but his posture was stiff. He carried an air of formality that suggested he'd been summoned to deal with an issue. "Ms. Johnson," the supervisor began, his tone overly polite. "I'm James, the flight supervisor. I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seating." Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. "There's no confusion. I purchased this first-class seat, and I intend to remain here." James hesitated, glancing briefly at the flight attendant, who stood beside him with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I see. Unfortunately, there appears to have been an error in our system. This seat has been double-booked, and we'll need you to relocate to the main cabin." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow, her tone calm but pointed. "Double-booked? I've heard that excuse before. Would you be asking me to move if I were someone else?" James stiffened at her words, his composure faltering for a fraction of a second. "Ma'am, I assure you this has nothing to do with." "Doesn't it?" Aaliyah interjected, her voice firm but not raised. "Because I find it curious that out of all the passengers in first class, I'm the one being singled out. I paid for this seat, and unless you have a legitimate reason, I'm not moving." The quiet conviction in her tone made James pause. He exchanged a quick glance with the flight attendant, who was now visibly irritated. "Ms. Johnson," he said carefully, "this is not about discrimination. We simply need to accommodate another passenger." "And that passenger is more deserving of this seat than I am?" Aaliyah asked, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "If you'd like to bring them over, I'd be happy to discuss the situation directly." The suggestion caught James off guard, and he stammered slightly. That won't be necessary." "Then I'll stay right here," Aaliyah said. "I suggest you check your records and sort out your error without disrupting your paying customers." A flicker of something crossed James's face, frustration, perhaps, or maybe reluctant respect. The flight attendant, however, was less composed. "This isn't up for debate," she snapped, her voice louder now. "You need to move." Before Aaliyah could respond, a voice from across the aisle interrupted. "She's not going anywhere." The words came from the older man with the tablet. He placed it on his tray table and leaned forward, his gray eyes piercing. "I've been sitting here the whole time and I've heard every word. This lady has done nothing wrong. She paid for her seat. Leave her alone. The tension in the cabin thickened as murmurs spread among the passengers. A young woman seated a few rows behind chimed in, "Yeah, this feels wrong. She shouldn't have to move." The flight attendant's face flushed, and James raised his hands in an attempt to diffuse the growing unrest. "Please, everyone, we're simply trying to resolve a misunderstanding." By harassing her? The woman across the aisle folded her arms. "I don't think so. She's right, why her? Why not someone else?" James's composure was slipping, and the flight attendant looked as if she wished she could disappear. Aaliyah remained seated, her expression unreadable, but inside, she felt a flicker of validation. The tide was turning, and the passenger's support was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. Before James could respond, another voice rang out. "If she's being asked to move, I'll give up my seat instead." It was the young couple, the man standing now and gesturing toward his seat. His partner nodded in agreement, her eyes narrowed at the flight crew. "This isn't right." The cabin buzzed with quiet outrage as more passengers voiced their opinions. Aaliyah sat in silence, her gaze fixed on James, who now looked overwhelmed. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence evaporating. "Enough," a commanding voice said from the back of the first-class cabin. Everyone turned to see a tall woman in a navy skirt suit approaching. Her name tag identified her as the captain of the flight. Her stride was deliberate, her expression calm but firm. "What's going on here?" James and the flight attendant exchanged panicked looks, but before either could speak, the older man across the aisle filled her in. "They're trying to kick this lady out of her seat for no reason," he said bluntly. "She's done nothing wrong, and we're not going to sit here and let it happen." The captain's sharp eyes darted to Aaliyah, who met her gaze with quiet strength. "Is this true?" she asked James. James stammered, "It was a seating issue, Captain. We were just trying to resolve it." "By targeting one passenger?" the captain asked, her voice cold. "And causing a disruption in the process? That's unacceptable." She turned to Aaliyah. "Ms. Johnson, I apologize for this situation. You are welcome to remain in your seat. If you have any further concerns, please don't hesitate to let me know." Aaliyah nodded, her voice calm. "Thank you, Captain." The captain turned back to James and the flight attendant. "We'll discuss this further after the flight," she said curtly. "For now, I suggest you focus on doing your jobs professionally." The flight attendant's face turned crimson, and James looked as though he wished the ground would swallow him whole. They retreated quickly, leaving the captain to address the cabin. "Thank you all for your patience," she said. "We'll be departing shortly." As the captain returned to the cockpit, a wave of relief washed over Aaliyah. The passengers around her smiled or nodded in support, and the man across the aisle gave her a thumbs up. For the first time since boarding, Aaliyah allowed herself to relax. But the incident wasn't something she could simply forget. It was a reminder of the battles still to be fought, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday moments like this. And as the plane took off, Aaliyah's mind began to turn. This experience wasn't just another case of discrimination, it was an opportunity to shine a light on the biases that persisted in spaces meant to be equal. She pulled out her laptop and began typing furiously, her fingers flying across the keyboard. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, she had outlined a powerful op-ed about her experience, weaving it into the broader context of systemic discrimination and the need for accountability. 7 minutes of discrimination had ignited a fire within her, and Aaliyah Johnson was determined to ensure that no one, regardless of their race, age, or status, would ever have to fight for their rightful place in the world. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane reached its cruising altitude. The tension from earlier had begun to dissipate, but Aaliyah could still feel the residue of what had transpired. She stared at the screen of her laptop, the op-ed she had begun still blinking at her in its skeletal form. Words usually flowed from her effortlessly. After all, she was a seasoned attorney known for crafting arguments that dismantled even the most fortified defenses. But now, her thoughts were swirling with emotions she couldn't quite pin down. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and she let out a slow, controlled breath. This wasn't just about her, this was about everyone who had ever been made to feel small, unwelcome, or undeserving in spaces they had every right to occupy. She thought of her mother, who had worked double shifts as a nurse in the segregated South to ensure Aaliyah had a future beyond her wildest dreams. She thought of the clients she'd represented, each of them carrying stories of injustice that deserved to be heard. A voice broke her reverie. "Excuse me, ma'am," said the young man who had offered to give up his seat earlier. He was standing in the aisle, his expression tentative. His partner, the young woman, stood beside him, clutching a tablet. "I just wanted to say, what happened back there wasn't right. My wife and I, we saw the whole thing. And we're really sorry you had to go through that." Aaliyah closed her laptop and offered a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The man hesitated before continuing. "If there's anything we can do. I don't know, maybe write a statement or something? We'd be happy to help." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. Aaliyah was used to fighting her battles alone, accustomed to the isolation that came with standing against injustice. She nodded, a spark of gratitude lighting her eyes. "Actually, that could be helpful. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to get your account of what happened." The young woman handed over her tablet. "We already started drafting something. It's not much, but maybe it'll help." Aaliyah glanced at the screen. The couple had written a detailed account of the incident, highlighting the flight attendant's dismissive tone and the way the supervisor had mishandled the situation. It was concise yet powerful, capturing the essence of what she herself had felt. "This is excellent," Aaliyah said, her voice warm. "Thank you both. It means a lot to me." The couple exchanged relieved smiles before returning to their seats. Aaliyah reopened her laptop and incorporated their account into her op-ed. With every word she typed, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a story about one woman's experience, it was a mirror reflecting the pervasive biases that still infected society, even in spaces as mundane as a flight cabin. As she worked, she noticed more passengers glancing her way. Some offered encouraging smiles, while others seemed deep in thought, as if reconsidering their own perspectives. It was clear the incident had struck a chord, not just with her, but with the entire cabin. The older man across the aisle leaned over. "If you don't mind me saying, that was impressive," he said. "The way you handled yourself back there, it's not easy to stay composed in a situation like that." Aaliyah gave him a modest nod. "Thank you. I've had practice." He chuckled dryly. "Haven't we all?" He extended a hand. "Mark Chambers. I'm a journalist, by the way. Used to work for the Times." That caught her attention. "Aaliyah Johnson," she said, shaking his hand. "Civil rights attorney." Mark raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. "That explains a lot. You've got the demeanor of someone who's used to standing her ground." "It comes with the territory," she replied. "I can't afford not to." Mark leaned back, studying her. "You know, this incident, it's bigger than just what happened to you. It's emblematic of a larger problem. If you're open to it, I'd like to help you amplify this story." Aaliyah hesitated. She was no stranger to media attention, but she also knew the risks of putting herself in the spotlight. Still, there was something about Mark's tone that felt genuine, a shared understanding of the importance of truth-telling. "I'm writing an op-ed about it," she said finally. "If you'd like to take a look, I'd welcome your feedback." Mark nodded. "Send it my way when you're ready. And if you decide you want to take this to a larger platform, I've got a few connections that could help." They exchanged contact information, and Aaliyah felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just about setting the record straight, it was about leveraging her experience to spark a broader conversation. As the flight continued, the energy in the cabin shifted. Passengers who had been passive observers earlier now seemed more engaged. Aaliyah noticed a woman in her 50s typing furiously on her phone, occasionally glancing her way. A group of business travelers in the row ahead whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of anger and resolve. When the flight attendant returned to offer drinks, her demeanor was noticeably subdued. She avoided eye contact with Aaliyah, her earlier confidence replaced with a stiffness that bordered on discomfort. Aaliyah accepted her glass of water with a polite nod, choosing not to escalate the situation further. But the real shift came when the captain made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to thank you for your patience earlier and assure you that the situation has been addressed. We appreciate your understanding as we work to ensure every passenger feels respected and valued." The message was carefully worded, but its implications were clear. The captain had taken note of the passengers' reactions, and she wasn't about to let the incident be swept under the rug. Aaliyah felt a small sense of vindication. While it wouldn't erase what had happened, it was a step toward accountability. As the plane began its descent, Aaliyah saved her op-ed draft and closed her laptop. She gazed out the window, the city below coming into view, its grid of streets and glowing lights stretching endlessly. This flight, which had begun as a simple journey, had become something much more, a microcosm of the larger battles she fought every day. When the plane touched down, the passengers began gathering their belongings. Many stopped to speak with Aaliyah on their way out, offering words of support or sharing their own stories of injustice. The young couple handed her a printed copy of their statement, and Mark promised to follow up soon. As Aaliyah stepped off the plane, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. What had started as an infuriating incident had transformed into a moment of collective awakening. People who might have stayed silent had spoken up. Strangers had become allies. And Aaliyah had found a renewed sense of purpose in the fight for justice. The airport terminal buzzed with activity, but Aaliyah moved through it with a clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't just heading to her next destination, she was carrying with her the momentum of a story that needed to be told, and the resolve to make sure it reached the people who needed to hear it most. Aaliyah stepped off the plane and into the bustling airport terminal, her heels clicking against the polished tiles as she adjusted her bag on her shoulder. The cool, recycled air of the terminal hit her like a refreshing breeze after the charged atmosphere of the flight. But even as she walked toward the baggage claim, the events of the flight weighed heavily on her mind. It wasn't just the injustice she had faced, it was the reactions of those around her, the ripple effect that her stand had created. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Mark Chambers, the journalist who had introduced himself during the flight. "Mark, Aaliyah, I meant what I said about helping you get this story out there. Let me know if you're open to collaborating. This needs to be heard." She smiled faintly. Mark was right, this story wasn't just about her experience. It was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment, often without the means or platform to speak up. Aaliyah quickly typed a response. "Aaliyah, thank you, Mark. I'll send you my op-ed draft tonight. Let's discuss next steps soon." She slipped her phone back into her bag and continued walking, her mind already racing with ideas. By the time she reached the baggage claim, her plan was taking shape. She wouldn't just stop at writing an op-ed. This was an opportunity to create a broader impact, to shed light on systemic issues that extended far beyond a single flight. As she waited for her luggage, her thoughts were interrupted by the young couple from the plane. They approached her with tentative smiles, their overnight bags slung over their shoulders. "Ms. Johnson," the man said, his voice hesitant but warm. "We just wanted to say goodbye and thank you for the way you handled everything back there. You inspired us." Aaliyah turned to face them fully, her expression softening. "Thank you for your support. It meant a lot to me." The woman chimed in, her eyes shining with emotion. "We've seen things like that happen before, but we've never known how to respond. Watching you stand your ground, and seeing how everyone rallied around you, it was powerful." Aaliyah nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not always easy, but silence only lets these things continue. Speaking up can make a difference, even if it's uncomfortable. The man reached into his pocket and handed her a business card. If you ever need anything, legal help, community support, anything, please don't hesitate to reach out. We work with a few nonprofits that focus on equality and social justice. Aaliyah took the card and glanced at it. Their names, Ethan and Maria Delgado, were printed in bold letters, along with the name of their organization, Bridges for Change. Aaliyah recognized the name. The group had gained attention for its grassroots efforts to address inequities in housing and education. "Thank you," she said, slipping the card into her pocket. "I'll be in touch." As the couple walked away, Aaliyah's luggage finally appeared on the conveyor belt. She grabbed her sleek black suitcase and made her way toward the exit, her mind buzzing with ideas. The interaction with the Delgados had sparked something in her, a realization that her story could be a catalyst for building connections and creating change on a larger scale. The ride to her hotel was quiet, the city's skyline glowing against the night sky. Aaliyah stared out the window, her thoughts drifting to the case she was preparing for. It was a high-stakes discrimination lawsuit against a major corporation, and the outcome could set a powerful precedent. But now, the flight incident loomed large in her mind, intertwining with the work she was already doing. When she arrived at the hotel, she checked in quickly and headed up to her room. The space was modern and luxurious, but she barely noticed as she dropped her bags and sat down at the sleek glass desk. She opened her laptop, her fingers immediately finding the keys. The op-ed she had started on the plane was still open, waiting for her to continue. But now, her perspective had shifted. The story wasn't just about the confrontation on the plane, it was about what happened afterward. The solidarity of the passengers, the captain's intervention, and the support from people like the Delgados and Mark had turned a moment of discrimination into a collective stand against injustice. She began typing, her words flowing with renewed clarity. Sometimes, change begins in the unlikeliest of places, a crowded airplane cabin, for instance, where biases that linger in society are laid bare. What I experienced wasn't unique, it was a symptom of a larger issue, one that affects countless people every day. But what happened next, that was unique. Strangers became allies, silence gave way to voices, and a moment of injustice became a spark for change. Aaliyah poured her heart into the piece, weaving her personal experience with a broader call to action. She highlighted the importance of speaking up, of creating spaces where people could hold one another accountable. She wrote about the power of collective action, of turning small moments into larger movements. When she finished, she saved the document and attached it to an email addressed to Mark. Subject: Draft op-ed, 7 minutes in the air, a lifetime of injustice ***. Mark. Attached is my op-ed draft. I'd love your feedback and any suggestions you might have for placing this with a major publication. Thank you again for your support. Best. Aaliyah. Satisfied, she hit send and leaned back in her chair. The weight of the day pressed down on her, but so did a sense of accomplishment. She had taken the first step toward turning her experience into something meaningful. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from social media. Curious, she opened the app and found that someone had posted a video of the incident on the plane. The caption read, "When injustice takes flight, this woman stood her ground. Watch what happens next." The video had already gained thousands of views, with comments flooding in from people expressing outrage, support, and admiration. Aaliyah's stomach tightened. She hadn't anticipated the incident going viral, but it wasn't surprising in today's hyper-connected world. The video showed her calm yet firm stance, the flight attendant's dismissive tone, and the passengers rallying behind her. It was a compelling narrative, and she knew it would only amplify the reach of her message. She took a deep breath and decided to embrace the momentum. Opening her social media app, she shared the video along with a brief caption. "This isn't just my story, it's our story. It's about the spaces we occupy and the voices we raise when injustice tries to silence us. Together, we can do better. #StandYourGround, #equality for all." Within minutes, her post began to gain traction. Comments and messages poured in from people sharing their own experiences, offering support, and thanking her for speaking up. Aaliyah felt a swell of emotion as she read through them, each story a reminder of why she fought so hard in the first place. As the night wore on, Aaliyah received a reply from Mark. His email was brief, but enthusiastic. "Mark, this is powerful, Aaliyah. Let's pitch this to the New York Times and Washington Post tomorrow. I'll reach out to my contacts first thing in the morning." Aaliyah closed her laptop, exhaustion finally catching up with her. She crawled into bed, her mind buzzing with anticipation. This was just the beginning. The events on the plane had ignited a fire, not just in her, but in everyone who had witnessed it, both in person and now online. As she drifted off to sleep, one thought stood out above all the others: sometimes, change begins in the unlikeliest of places, but it only grows when people refuse to stay silent. And Aaliyah Johnson had no intention of staying silent. The morning sun streamed through the hotel curtains, casting a golden glow on the polished furniture and neatly arranged room. Aaliyah woke to the soft chime of her phone, signaling a string of notifications. As she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, she reached for the device on the nightstand, her inbox and social media already buzzing with activity. The post she'd shared the previous night had gone viral, far beyond what she had anticipated. Overnight, the video had garnered millions of views and sparked heated discussions across platforms. Messages poured in from people sharing their own stories of injustice, from organizations offering support, and from media outlets requesting interviews. Her name was trending, and the incident on the plane had become a flashpoint in a broader conversation about systemic bias and discrimination in everyday spaces. Aaliyah sat up, her heart racing as she scrolled through the messages. It was overwhelming, but it was also energizing. People were paying attention, and she knew this was an opportunity to amplify the voices that often went unheard. She opened an email from Mark, who had already reached out to his contacts at major publications. Mark. "Good morning, Aaliyah. The op-ed is a hit. Both the Times and the Post want to run it. We need to finalize a few details, but they're both eager to publish as soon as possible. Let's discuss next steps when you're ready. Also, brace yourself, the media storm has begun. Multiple networks have reached out to me for interviews with you. Call me when you can." She smiled faintly and quickly replied, letting Mark know she was ready to move forward. Her phone buzzed again, this time a call from Ethan Delgado, the young man she had met on the plane. "Aaliyah," he began, his voice warm but urgent. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," she said, leaning back against the headboard. "What's on your mind?" "I don't know if you've seen it, but the video of the incident has taken on a life of its own," Ethan said. "Maria and I were talking, and we think this could be the perfect moment to launch a broader campaign. Something that goes beyond the flight, something that addresses systemic bias in travel, corporate spaces, and beyond." Aaliyah nodded, already thinking of the possibilities. "I've seen the momentum and I agree. What did you have in mind?" "Well," Ethan continued, "Bridges for Change has been working on a campaign called Equity in Everyday Spaces. It's still in its early stages, but your story could be the catalyst we need to bring it to the forefront. If you're willing, we'd love to collaborate with you." The idea struck a chord with Aaliyah. Her legal work often focused on systemic change through the courts, but this was an opportunity to engage directly with the public. "I'm interested," she said. "Let's set up a meeting to discuss the details." After ending the call, Aaliyah wasted no time. She drafted a quick email to her team at the firm, outlining her plans to integrate her experience from the flight into her broader work. She knew her colleagues would support her. They had seen firsthand how personal stories could fuel the fight for justice. By mid-morning, Aaliyah was on a video call with Mark, Ethan, and Maria, mapping out a strategy. The campaign would combine her personal narrative with actionable steps for individuals and organizations to combat bias. They brainstormed hashtags, discussed partnerships with other advocacy groups, and outlined a timeline for rolling out the initiative. "We'll start with a virtual town hall," Maria suggested. You can share your story and invite others to share theirs. It'll set the tone for the campaign and create a sense of community. Aaliyah nodded. And we'll need to focus on education. Too often, people don't even realize the biases they carry. If we can provide resources, workshops, webinars, even toolkits for companies, we can start to make a real impact. Mark chimed in, his voice enthusiastic. I can help with media outreach. There's a lot of interest right now, and if we play this right, we can keep the momentum going. They worked through the details for hours, the excitement in the room palpable even through the screen. By the time they wrapped up, Aaliyah felt invigorated. The campaign was more than just a response to what had happened on the plane, it was a call to action, a way to turn a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Over the next few days, Aaliyah's schedule became a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and planning sessions. She appeared on morning shows and podcasts, sharing her story with audiences around the world. Each time, she emphasized the importance of collective action, of recognizing and challenging the biases that shape society. Her op-ed was published in the New York Times under the title 7 Minutes in the Air, a call for equity in everyday spaces. It was met with widespread acclaim, sparking discussions in workplaces, schools, and homes. Letters poured in from readers, many of whom shared their own experiences of discrimination and expressed gratitude for her courage. The virtual town hall, held a week after the incident, was a resounding success. Thousands of people tuned in from across the globe, filling the chat with stories, questions, and words of encouragement. Aaliyah listened intently as people shared their struggles and triumphs, their voices weaving a tapestry of resilience and hope. One woman, a flight attendant, spoke through tears. I've seen incidents like this happen too many times, and I've been afraid to speak up. But after hearing your story, I feel like I can finally start making a difference. A young man from a rural town shared how he had confronted his own biases after watching the viral video. I realized I've been complicit in the way I treat people who don't look like me. I'm committed to doing better. The campaign gained traction rapidly, with partnerships forming between advocacy groups, corporations, and community organizations. Workshops were held to educate employees on implicit bias, while schools integrated lessons on equity into their curricula. Social media platforms lit up with posts from people sharing their own moments of standing up against injustice, using the hashtag equity in everyday. Despite the flurry of activity, Aaliyah remained grounded. She continued her legal work, pouring the same passion into her cases as she did into the campaign. She knew that real change required effort on multiple fronts: legislation, education, and grassroots action. Weeks turned into months, and the impact of the campaign became undeniable. Reports began to emerge of companies re-evaluating their policies, of individuals taking steps to address their biases, of communities coming together to create more inclusive spaces. Aaliyah watched it all with a mix of pride and humility, knowing that her story had simply been the spark. One evening, as she sat in her office preparing for a trial, her phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. Ethan, thought you'd like to see this. Check the news. Curious, Aaliyah opened the link he'd sent. It was an article about the airline from her flight, announcing a comprehensive review of its training programs and a commitment to addressing systemic bias within the company. The statement included an acknowledgement of the incident involving Aaliyah and outlined steps the airline was taking to ensure it wouldn't happen again. Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, a smile spreading across her face. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one, a reminder that even the most entrenched systems could change when people refused to stay silent. As she turned back to her work, Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was long, but she wasn't walking it alone. Together, with allies like Mark, Ethan, Maria, and countless others who had joined the movement, she knew they were building a world where equity wasn't just an aspiration, it was a reality.